Today's daf is Memvav. We're going to start on the second line of Memvav Amud Aleph with a new piece. Amar Rabbi Elazar Mishum Bar Kapara. Now, yesterday the daf spoke about how many ma'arachot were organized on top of the Mizbeach. Were there 2 normally, and 3 on Yom Kippur, 3 normally, and 4 on Yom Kippur, 4 normally, and 5 on Yom Kippur. So today Rabbi Elazar is saying in the name of Bar Kapara with regard to Rabbi Meir's view. Rabbi Meir had said that there's an extra ma'aracha that's set up for burning yesterday's leftover limbs that were never burnt. Okay? So Rabbi Elazar Mishum Bar Kapara. Rabbi Elazar said in the name of Bar Kapara. Omer Haya Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir used to say, Evrei Olah shenitotiru. Leftover limbs. Nitotru means that they were left over. So limbs of an olah that were left over, oselahen maracha b'fnei atzma. You make for them a maracha, a pyre in and of itself. V'soderan, and you organize it afilu b'Shabbat, even on Shabbat. Meaning, even if yesterday what happened was that the korban tamid, let's say, yesterday's korban tamid was brought and the limbs were not consumed for whatever reason. So today
they were in the fire, they just weren't finished.
They didn't finish, or they didn't finish, or it didn't catch them, or whatever the case may be. So they set up a pyre, an additional pyre to burn yesterday's, even if it's Shabbat, meaning even if Friday's Korban Olah, let's say of the afternoon, wasn't consumed on the altar sufficiently, or not at all, for whatever reason it was. So they will set up a pyre on Shabbat, even on Shabbat, to burn yesterday's Korbanot. That's part of the Chidush here. Part of the Chidush is that even though it's Shabbat, and you really shouldn't be bringing any korbanot of previous days on Shabbat, because the dispensation for bringing korbanot on Shabbat is for the korbanot of Shabbat, not for the korbanot of Friday, and yet you're allowed to do it, or you're obligated to do it according to Rabbi Meir. So Maika Mashmalan, what is the Hidush here? What is the novelty here? We already know that Rabbi Meir says that Tanina B'chol Yom Hayusham Arba Marachot. Rabbi Meir already said that every day they had 4 ma'arachot, 4 pyres, and what was the 4th one? In order to burn yesterday's korbanot. So why is he saying Rabbi Meir used to say that you should make this pyre for yesterday's korbanot? Of course, he already said that. He said that in the Mishnah. Why that? Well, that's going to be one of the things. But first of all, why does he have to mention it? He says va'afilo b'Shabbat. He just should. He didn't have to repeat himself. It's 2 halachot being stated by Rabbi Meir in the name of Rabbi Meir. One is that you make them their own thing, and that it's even on Shabbat. So why do you have to mention this to begin with? Rabbi Avin said, Lo nitzrocha ela psulin. That this is necessary for psulin. In other words, let's say there was a korban that wasn't really supposed to be put up on the altar. So there's certain category of korbanot where it says im alu lo yeredu, that really this korban is pasul. There's certain categories of korbanot that really we shouldn't put these limbs up on the altar because the korban was pasul. However, im alu lo yeredu. If they went up, they don't come down. Once they're up there, we leave them. So the chidush is, even if this, in other words, you might say to yourself, well, these limbs really weren't supposed to be put up. We put them up by accident, and once you put them up, you have to leave them there. But the fact is that the fire didn't consume them, so now let's get them off. It's like a divine sign or something like that. Nope, you don't. You actually set up a pyre just to burn them, even though they weren't even supposed to be there to begin with. That's the chidush. That's why. That's the novelty in the ruling here. Even though they shouldn't have been there to begin with, once they're there, there's amnesty, right? Once they're there, they're now what's called lachmosh el mizbeach. Now they belong to the mizbeach. They're being consumed by the mizbeach, and you have to, even if it wasn't complete, you have to set up a pyre just for them. Now, that's only if what the fire had already partially consumed them. In other words, the fire had caught on to them. However, but if it happened that the fire did not catch them, in other words, the fire did not attach itself to these evarim that normally would have been not supposed to be there, these psulin that normally wouldn't be there. So we say that, well, since the fire already started to consume them but didn't succeed, we're going to make a pyre and we're going to burn them separately the next day. But if they didn't get singed at all by the fire, in other words, the fire did not come and begin the process of consumption, so therefore, since the fire didn't start the process of consumption, that means that, so to speak, it didn't become lachmosh el mizbeach. It didn't become something that really belonged to the Mizbeach. So we would not have this halacha of separating, of making a separate pyre to burn them. Okay? Now, the question is, what do you do with them? So, seemingly, you burn them together with everything else. You still burn them. You just don't have a separate pyre to burn them. Okay? Which is an interesting thing. It doesn't say that you take them off and throw them away. It doesn't say that. It just says that you don't make a separate pyre to burn them because they didn't achieve this status of lach moshel mizbeach. Ikad amri, some say, yeah.
But other rabbis accounted for the burning of leftovers without a special pyre.
Right. So, in other words, Rebbe Meir is saying my special halacha.
So for him,
of a special pyre, right?
Okay.
This is only according to him of a special pyre. That's what it seems like. Otherwise, you're going to have to say that no, they actually had to remove it. If it was pasul and the fire didn't attach to it, that maybe you even have to remove it. So I'm assuming the most, let's say, strict constructionist interpretation here, that it doesn't mean that you actually remove them, but it's going to mean that you leave them up there, but they're burned in the regular pyre. They're only burned in their own pyre if they caught fire. Okay? That's the most limited assumption. Otherwise, what are they going to do with them? Okay?
Well, the notice of only upon being singled somewhat by the altar, flame, the part becomes so completely...
Lach moshel mizbeach. Right. But what does it say you do with it if they didn't become singed?
It says, Chazon Ish in Orach Chaim says, that's what the unsinged part, however, are burnt upon the regular side.
Right, so that's what I thought. Yeah, just that they don't get their own separate one. That's what I thought.
This is only according to Rabbi.
There's no according to Rabbi Meir. This is all according to Rabbi Meir.
Right.
Yeah, all according to him. So now, v'ikad amri, some say, echad kshirin v'echad psulin li mashal behena or in vein lo lo. So there's another version that says no. That in other words, according to that view, there are two categories: leftover korbanot from yesterday that were totally kasher and leftover, meaning good ones, but they weren't consumed. That's where Rebbe Meir says you have to have a separate pyre. Or korbanot that were pisulim, but were partially consumed. So since they're partially consumed, they also get their own independent altar. Okay? However, according to the second version, no. Anything to justify its own separate pyre has to be partially consumed. Anything that's just sitting there and wasn't singed at all by the fire goes on the regular pyre. Only things that had a process already of being burnt by the altar and didn't complete that process, they get their own pyre. Whether kasher or pasul doesn't matter. So according to the first one, if it's kasher, even if it wasn't singed by yesterday's fire, it gets its own pyre. And if it's pasul, it had to have been singed by yesterday's fire. According to the second version, in both cases it has to be singed by yesterday's fire. You can understand it as saying that according to the first version, it has to be lach moshel mizbeach. Putting it up on the mizbeach in and of itself speaks for itself when it's a kasher korban. When it's a pasul korban, only if there was a process of burning that started. However, the second view is saying, no, since these korbanot yesterday already started their process of burning, they get an independent process today. Whether kasher or pasul. That's kind of the way that you can conceptualize it. Va'afilu b'Shabbat, Rabbi Meir said that even on Shabbat we make a separate pyre for yesterday's korbanot, even though normally you would not offer a korban of chol on Shabbat. So what's going on here? Answer is, so va'afilu b'Shabbat. Tanina, we already learned that in the Mishnah. First of all, the Gemara asks, v'hayom chamesh. It says today, meaning on Yom Kippur, you make 5 pyres. So Rabbi Meir is talking about Yom Kippur. So obviously if on Yom Kippur you make an extra pyre to burn yesterday's korbanot, it's the same as Shabbat. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, itzarich. No, you still need. Rabbi Meir had to mention it anyway. Why? Because you might have thought as follows. That's only when Yom Kippur fell on Sunday. We don't have Yom Kippur on Sunday today, but in the times of the Gemara, they did. So that means when it fell on Sunday, right? Because we could say that why are you making that 5th pyre according to Rabbi Meir to burn yesterday's korbanot? Only because why? Because yesterday was Shabbat. That's why. Okay, however, Shabbat, lo. But on a regular weekday, in other words, if Yom Kippur falls on Tuesday, we don't burn yesterday's korbanot on a separate pyre. If on Shabbat also, we wouldn't burn yesterday's korbanot on a separate pyre. This is only on Yom Kippur that falls on Sunday. And on regular weekdays, according to Rabbi Meir, of course, you make a separate pyre for burning yesterday's korbanot, and on Yom Kippur that falls on Sunday, but not on Shabbat. And the only reason you could do it on Yom Kippur that falls on Sunday is because you're burning yesterday's korbanot that happened to be the Shabbat korbanot. Therefore, we need Kamash Malan. He has to come along and tell you that no, always do you make the separate pyre. You might have assumed that it was very limited, that it's only Yom Kippur that falls on Sunday that you would make a separate pyre. But on a regular Shabbat, where you're burning a regular Friday's korbanot on Shabbat, you wouldn't do that. So therefore, Rabbi Meir has to emphasize, yes, every day, meaning even Shabbat, you have to put, even a regular Shabbat, even though what you're going to be burning is leftover korbanot from Friday, you need a separate pyre. And on a regular Yom Kippur, even if it falls on Wednesday or Thursday, you need a separate pyre for yesterday's korbanot. It's not considered a chilul, a desecration or a denigration of Shabbat or Yom Kippur to be burning yesterday's korbanot, even though it means making a separate pyre for them. Okay, so that's why you had to emphasize that even on Shabbat, meaning don't think that I only meant Yom Kippur that falls on a Sunday. I mean every day, literally. Amar Rava says, "Man hay lo chaysh lekim chay." Who is this person who's not careful about his flour? Lo chaysh lekim chay means he doesn't worry about his flour, meaning he's not precise in his teaching. He's saying something that's not correct. He's not accurate. Who is this that's saying that? Ha bechol yom tenan. It says explicitly in the Mishnah, bechol yom. Every day you make the fifth pyre. Obviously Rabbi Meir meant even Shabbat. He says every day. And you're trying to say, well, you might have thought it only means Yom Kippur that falls on a Sunday. What do you mean you might have thought it only means Yom Kippur that falls on a Sunday? He says B'chol Yom, that means every day including Shabbat and including Yom Kippur, including every day. Kashya, the Gemara says, you're right, it's a difficulty. Why did Rabbi Meir have to preempt an assumption? Why did he have to preempt your assumption that we're only talking about Yom Kippur that falls on Sunday when he said already B'chol Yom, every day? It should have been understandable every day. Means even Shabbat, even Yom Kippur, every day. Right? That's so.
Somebody taught that he taught that, and the Gemara points out that was sloppy thinking because why would you taught? Why would you teach that he taught that if since the Mishnah already says every day?
Right. In other words, the Mishnah already says every day. So why do you have to emphasize even on Shabbat?
Whoever is reporting that Rabbi Meir did it for that reason, was talking about it so that we wouldn't think it was just...
Right, well, why do you have to emphasize on Shabbat? Saying, even on Shabbat. What do you mean even on Shabbat? You said every day. Because you might have thought something else. No, I wouldn't have thought something else. It says every day.
Rabbi Meir, it was a question...
On the reporters of him. Yeah, saying, why do you need this extra emphasis here? Every day means every day. What do you mean I might have thought it only meant Yom Kippur on Sunday? That's not a good reason. Every day means what it means.
So can we assume at this point that... all of the rabbis have at this point rejected Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that it's only two?
They're not rejecting. They're just dealing with one at a time.
Oh.
I mean, they deal with one at a time. It doesn't mean it has to be a rejection. I mean, you can't always tell. That's why they always say, like the Rishonim talk about the difficulty of reading the sugyot and deriving what the halakha is, because actually the halakha that's codified in the Rambam, if you look back at the Mishnah, it's Rabbi Yossei's view, not Rabbi Meir. Yeah, the three. So it's Rabbi Yossei's view, not Rabbi Meir and not Rabbi Yehuda. So you can't always tell from. Sometimes the Rishonim will say, well, from the fact that the Gemara is focused on working out the Shita of Rabbi Meir, that shows that the halakha must follow Rabbi Meir. But it's not always the case. Sometimes it'll work really hard to figure out Beit Shammai. That doesn't mean the halakha follows Beit Shammai. Right. Now, so you can't always tell. So here the halakha is codified like Rabbi Yossei, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to understand Rabbi Meir.
The one that presented the most difficulty, and that's why
they're dealing with it. Yeah, they still have to deal with it.
When the Gemara is doing that, trying to work really hard to explain one position,
right?
And they might say, well, he uses this. We went into this yesterday.
Right, where he uses different pasukim and all that.
He uses this pasuk to support him, but this one disagrees with him. So what would he say about that pasuk?
Right.
When that kind of
they're
process
theorizing
happens,
about it.
Who's
that's the
redactors?
Talking.
That's the
That's the Gemara talking.
That's the writer down guys.
We don't know exactly, who's doing that. Yeah. It's sometimes called the Stamad Gemara, meaning it's the anonymous Gemara, the voice of the Gemara itself, which was edited by Ravina and Ravashi at the end when they closed the Gemara. This was the edited, redacted discussions of the people in the Beit Midrash.
So they theoretically,
the last generation,
they had final responsibility for making sure that all
tying
the
up all the
arguments
loose
were
ends.
Exactly. That's what
exactly. Yeah.
So it would go to them probably as long as we know.
It was on Ravina and Ravashi's
Very cool.
Responsibility, or the Savorayim who came right after that. We don't know. I mean, sometimes some Sugiyot are from Savorayim, but and sometimes the Rishonim mention that they know that it was because they have earlier manuscripts, or because they can just figure it out from one way or another.
So it was getting redacted over and over and over again, at least oral.
That's why the Bavli is so smooth. It flows very smoothly. I mean, if you look at the Yerushalmi for an unredacted version of what a Gemara conversation looks like, that's where you see it. Here it's very well developed, very smooth. Now. In any case, so kashya. When the Gemara ends with kashya, that means that's a good kashya. It's a good difficulty, very acceptable, but not tiyufta. We're not rejecting the interpretation that was given, that maybe you might have misunderstood Rabbi Meir's view. We're just saying kashya. It's not so smooth that somebody would think that about Rabbi Meir, being that he says b'chol yom. Now, the Gemara goes on and says that actually upliga de Rav Huna. This whole thing is in contradiction to what Rav Huna says. In other words, Bar Kapara's interpretation is in contradiction to what Rav Huna says, because he said, "The Amar Tchilato doche, sofo eno doche," because he said the beginning overrides and the end doesn't override. What does that mean? What does it mean? So Rashi explains, Ad de Bar Kaparat, Va'ad Rabba de Amar, B'chol Yom de Matnitin Davkahu, Va'afila B'Shabbat, Rav Huna Savar B'chol Yom Levar Mi Shabbat, because actually Rav Huna holds the opposite. He says, according to Rabbi Meir, you do not make this separate pyre for burning yesterday's korbanot on Shabbat. You don't do it on Shabbat. Every other day, Sunday through Friday, yes, but not on Shabbat. Okay? So that's what Rav Huna holds. Gufa, we go back to that statement of Rav Huna. What is it talking about? Okay, it means as follows. Rav Huna said, "Tamid tchilato doche, sofo eno doche." The korban tamid, its beginning overrides, its end doesn't override. What does this mean? Its beginning overrides and its end doesn't override. We have to understand what it's talking about here. So, Rav Chizda amar doche et Shabbat eno doche et tum'ah. Rav Chizda says it means that it overrides Shabbat, but it doesn't override Tum'ah. It doesn't override impurity. Okay, so Rav Chizda says that it's talking about the Korban Tamid, that what it means is it overrides Shabbat, but it doesn't override Tum'ah. What doesn't? The end, okay? So I'm going to explain this in a second, alright? The beginning of the Korban Tamid overrides Shabbat and Tum'ah. But the end doesn't override Tum'ah. It only overrides Shabbat. And Rabbah, it should say, not Rabbah, but Rabbah Amar, Dochayet Tum'ah, Ve'eno Dochayet Shabbat. That the beginning overrides both Tum'ah and Shabbat, but the end overrides Tum'ah, but not Shabbat. Now what does this mean? So Rashi offers two interpretations. The first of which is actually the interpretation also brought by Rabbeinu Hananel, which means it's a Geonic interpretation, which in many ways gives it more weight in my eyes, at least. That Rashi gives his own interpretation, and Tosafot brings a third interpretation of what this is talking about. So, if you look in Rashi, what does Rashi says it means when it says Tchila, Sof? What does it mean? The beginning, the end. So Tchilato Doche, Rashi says Tamid Shel Shabbat Nishhat b'Shabbat v'Karev b'Shabbat. That the Tamid of Shabbat, the Korban Tamid that's brought on Shabbat, is slaughtered and offered on Shabbat completely. But Sofo eno doche. What does Sofo mean? Tamid shel erev Shabbat en evarav niktarin mishetehshach ela ma'alan mib'od yom. It means on Friday, the Korban of the afternoon. On Friday, you can. It doesn't override Shabbat. So in other words, the beginning of a Korban Tamid, meaning the Korban Tamid that's appropriate for Shabbat, overrides Shabbat completely. But the Korban that was done yesterday, Sofo, the end of the Korban of yesterday, Eino Docheta Shabbat.
So that means you wouldn't, according to this, you wouldn't burn the leftover, the incomplete consumption.
Of yesterday's, that's right. That's what it's saying. Now, what does it mean? So in terms of but Tum'ah, it would override. What does it mean Tum'ah would override? What it means to say is, let's say the Korban Tamid of today has to be brought, but all the Kohanim are Tameh, or the majority of the Jewish people are Tameh. So what do? We know that Tum'ah is pushed aside for the Korbanot. So that's true about today's Korban, but can I burn yesterday's leftover Korban? Right now I have to burn this Korban even though I'm Betum'ah. What about yesterday's Korban? So he's saying that yes, that leftover Korbanot do not override Shabbat. Leftover Korbanot from Friday? No. but they do override tum'ah. Yesterday's korbanot, leftover pieces, could be burnt today, even though you're betum'ah. Since you're already doing, the korban tamid of today, you could also do yesterday's finish. Okay? That's what Rav Chisda says. So that clearly contradicts bar kapara, because it's saying you cannot burn yesterday's korbanot on Shabbat. At least certainly not separately. Right? Amar le Abai. So, however, Rabbah says the opposite. He says that. I'm sorry, I said the reverse of what I meant to say. Right? Rav Chisda says it overrides Shabbat, but not Tum'ah. Rabbah is the one that I just said. Rabbah is the one that says that it overrides Tum'ah, but not Shabbat. Meaning yesterday's korbanot will override Tum'ah, that if you're Tameh today, you don't have to say, well, I'm Tameh, I can't bring it. But they won't override Shabbat. Whereas Rav Chisda said the opposite, that yesterday's will override Shabbat, but not the Tum'ah. And if I'm Tameh, I can only do today's immediate need, but I can't do yesterday's makeup. However, if yesterday's makeup can be done on Shabbat, according to Rav Chisda. So this machloket, in a way, parallels the machloket of Bar Kapara, right? But Bar Kapara is saying that yesterday's korbanot are brought even on Shabbat, meaning the leftovers can be burnt on Shabbat in a separate pyre, and Rav Chisda, according to Rabbah here, it's not true. According to Rabbah, yesterday's korbanot cannot be brought on Shabbat. Okay, that's against Bar Kapara. They're both interpreting Rav Huna, because Rav Huna said the korban tamid, its beginning overrides, its end doesn't override. What does that mean? If we have time, we'll go back and see the other interpretation of Rashi. But for now, let's stick with this interpretation because it's Rabbeinu Chanan Elza, and I think it flows relatively smoothly. Marle Abaye le Rabbah. It should be Abaye said to Rabbah ledidach kasha le Rav Chisda kasha. I don't like either of your interpretations, not yours and not Rav Chisda. They're both problematic. Why? Ledidach kasha ma'ishna tumah dechtiv b'moadav avil b'tumah Shabbat nami b'moadav avil b'Shabbat. That what's the difference between tumah and Shabbat? I mean, if yesterday's korbanot can override tumah, they should also be able to override Shabbat. Because why do they override Tum'ah? Because it says b'mo'ado, in its proper time, even b'tum'ah. It also says b'mo'ado afilu b'Shabbat. In other words, if you're going to tell me that we're overriding Tum'ah, you should also override Shabbat. And similarly, in other words, the same thing. The pasuk from which we learn that a korban overrides Shabbat, and the pasuk from which we learn that a korban overrides Tum'ah is the same pasuk, be'mo'ado, in its proper time, no matter what. So, how do you justify distinguishing between the two? So the answer is, Amar Lei, Rabbah said to him, Lo l'didi kasha v'lo l'Rav Chisda kasha. It's not a problem for me or Rav Chisda. I'll defend myself and my opponents. How so? L'didi lo kashya. It's not a problem for me because sofo ketchilato. I say the end has to be like the beginning. What does that mean? Tum'ah d'tchilato bar midcha tum'ah. Right? So when it comes to tum'ah, d'tchilato bar midcha tum'ahu sofo nami dachi. Since the beginning is capable of overriding, so too the end is capable of overriding. In other words, had I been Tameh yesterday and had to bring this korban, I would have brought it, B'tum'ah. So today that I'm Tameh, I can finish bringing it B'tum'ah. Okay? However, Shabbat t'chilato lav bar midcha Shabbat, but a Friday korban from the outset wasn't acceptable for Shabbat overriding because it was a Friday korban, not a Shabbat korban. So therefore, sofo nami lo dachi. In other words, because it was never a Shabbat korban, it was a yesterday korban. It's a Friday korban. A Friday korban is not capable of overriding Shabbat in and of itself. So if it wouldn't be capable of overriding Shabbat in and of itself, so its evarim, its limbs that are left over should not be capable of overriding Shabbat, to have a separate pyre made for them to be burnt on the altar on that day. Okay? So says Rabbah in defense of his position, that since Tum'ah would have been overridden for yesterday's Korban, it can be overridden for today's Korban. For yesterday's Korban being offered today. Because even yesterday Tum'ah would have been overridden, but Shabbat would never have been overridden for yesterday's Korban because it wasn't Shabbat. It was Friday. Good distinction. And he says, and for Rav Chisda he doesn't agree with me, Rav Chisda, that the end has to parallel the beginning, clearly, because he's saying the opposite. He's saying that it overrides Shabbat and not Tum'ah. So he's not buying into my distinction, but what does he say? Shabbat dehutrahi b'tzibur sofo nami dache. Tum'ah dechuyahi b'tzibur tchilato dikar kapara dache. Sofo telav ikar kapara lo dache. What is his distinction? He says like this. I'll make a distinction like this. That there's a difference between what's called hutira and dechuya. Hutira means something is cancelled. It doesn't exist. In other words, you have a conflict between two halachic things. two halachot, two mitzvot, for example. You have a halacha, you have a contradiction between, let's say, yibum and the prohibition of marrying your brother's wife. We don't say I'm overriding, every time I live with my new wife now, I'm overriding the prohibition of living with my brother's wife. No. It's hutra. It's hutra. It's gone. It's gone. It's out. It's gone. However, dechuya means what I'm doing. For example, when you have to violate Shabbat to save a life, or you have to violate Shabbat to do Brit Milah, we don't say, well, since I'm violating Shabbat anyway, I have to drive to the emergency room. I'll turn the radio on. I'll do other. No, you don't need to do other things. It's not hutra. It's dechuya. Dechuya means it still exists. There's a tension, but you have to choose one. There's a tension, but you have to choose one means you have to minimize. Yes, you have to choose one, and it encroaches on the other. You have to minimize the amount of violation of the other one. Because it's still there. It's still there. It's compromised. It's not, right. It's not, in other words, it's not canceling. It's not canceling. A is not canceling B.
Right.
A is taking precedence over B, but B is still there and you need to respect it. So that's the difference. So he says when it comes to Shabbat, there's no concept when you're doing korbanot on Shabbat that, oh, wait, you can't, be very careful because Shabbat doesn't exist with regard to the korbanot. The korbanot are korbanot.
So that's canceling.
So it's canceled. So therefore, since already on Shabbat we're doing everything for korbanot, and we don't ask ourselves, well, like when a doctor, for example, a religious doctor has to work on Shabbat, they don't not write notes in the chart. They have to be a doctor. I mean, it's very complicated and it's very problematic. I mean, exactly how much are they really allowed to do? It's a whole thing. I'm not giving a decision on that. It's not my purpose or my purview to do that, but you don't see religious doctors thinking, well, I can only do the surgery up to this point because that's what's necessary exactly. They think of it as hutra. Right? Now, is it really? Maybe not. Maybe it's not really, but that's another story. But in the korbanot, it's definitely hutra, which means we don't say, well, no, don't skin it all the way because you don't need to skin it all the way and you're doing a malacha. We don't think of it that way, right? We think of it as hutra. So since it's hutra for the kohen, he's allowed to do whatever he needs to do for the korbanot anyway. So, okay, make also a pyre for yesterday's korbanot. You're already involved. But tum'ah is dechuya, which means we only push away the tum'ah to the extent we have to. But we respect the institution of tum'ah. It's still present. It's just being overridden. So since it's present and being overridden as opposed to canceled, therefore, yes, I need to override tum'ah for today's korban, but that doesn't mean I have to make a pyre to burn yesterday's korbanot, a separate act of hakrava b'tum'ah, a separate act of offering these limbs b'tum'ah is not necessitated.
How does that get decided? The difference between what's going to be cancellation and what's going to be...
Sometimes it's a machloket. Sometimes it's an accepted Torah Sheba'al Peh. Oral Torah includes that as a principle. Sometimes it's a machloket. Sometimes they argue on it, whether something's dechuya or hutra. We've seen it before.
Okay.
We've seen before dechuya versus hutra in other settings. Yeah, there's in other settings we've seen machloket about that.
That would be the process. They might argue.
But that's what they argue. They'll try to bring a precedent to prove it one way or another. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. So his answer is that this is the distinction. Okay? Itmar was stated, now we know that what they would do is they would take some fire off of the outer altar and they would bring it to light the menorah if they needed to, or to light the ketoret, everyday ketoret, or the ketoret of Yom Kippur. So when they take fire into the pan, we know that there's a mitzvah. It says one of the lo ta'asem, one of the negative commandments is va'esh al mizbech tukad bo lo tichbeh, that the fire that's burning on the mizbech, you're not allowed to extinguish it. Lo tichbeh means you should not put it out. Okay. In other words, it's interpreted not just as meaning it shall not go out, right? But you should not put it out, right?
So taking fire from it is
sometimes needed, but you can't extinguish the fire as you take it out. That's the question. What happens if you took some of the fire and you extinguished it in your pan? You didn't extinguish it on the mizbeach. So then what's the halacha? Abaye amar hayav. Abaye says it's still considered esh hamizbeach. It's the fire of the mizbeach. So therefore, chayav, you are liable for extinguishing it even in your pan. Rava Amar Patur, Rava says you are exempt. The chayav. Now how would he get the fire? He would go up to the top of the mizbeach. The mizbeach is not like shoulder length. He can't just reach over. He has to go up the ramp, walk up there and take the fire in his shovel. So when he's on the Mizbeach itself, everybody agrees that if you were to extinguish it up there, the Hayav, it's still considered Esh HaMizbeach, as long as he's up there. The Machlok it is when you come down to the ground and do it, Abaye Amar Chayav Esh HaMizbeach. Abaye says that you are liable because it's still called the fire of the Mizbeach. Rava Amar Patur, Kevan de Nitka. Because Rava says you're exempt. Why? Because once it's separated from the Mizbeach, it's separated.
And it's not Mizbeach fire.
It's not Mizbeach fire anymore, you're using it for something else. Right? So that being the case, but what about the statement of Rav Nachman in the name of Rabba bar Avua? If somebody takes a piece of coal from on top of the Mizbeach, and he puts it out, he extinguishes it, chayav. He's liable. So Keman Ka'abaye. Obviously this can only follow this position of Abaye. Because Abaye says that if you take the gachelet, if you take the fire off of the Mizbeach, down onto the ground, and you extinguish it, you're liable. But Rava would say no. The Gemara says no. Afilu temake Rava. Even Rava would agree with this. Why? Because hatamlo intik lemitzvata hacha intik lemitzvata. Rava makes a distinction. He says, why do I hold? You see, you're misunderstanding me here. You're misunderstanding me. Why am I saying that when you take the fire off of the Mizbeach, it loses its status as Esh HaMizbeach? Why am I saying that? Not because of the physical change that you took it off. No. Really, if you took a coal off the Mizbeach, it could stay a coal of the Mizbeach. But you took it off here to light the menorah. You took it off here to burn the ketoret. It has a different purpose. You redefined the nature of this fire. But Rav Nachman is talking about a case where you just took it off the Mizbeach. You didn't give it a new designation. So that old designation is going to persist until a new designation is introduced. And that's why it's going to stay Esh HaMizbeach. Even according to me, Rava will say. So Rava and Abaye will agree if the fire just comes off the Mizbeach, even if it's on the ground, that it will still be the fire of the Mizbeach. So they will only disagree when it's being used for another mitzvah. Does that redesignate it? In other words, Abaye will say, what are you doing when you take fire to light the menorah, when you're taking fire to make the ketoret? You are taking fire of the Mizbeach. So it still has that status.
Would Abaye agree that if you redefine it, it's okay?
No, that's where they have the argument.
That's the argument.
That's the argument. Rava will say, even I agree, if you didn't redefine, it stays the same. But when you redefined it, does that remove its status as Esh HaMizbeach? Abaye will say, no, this is just a different use of the fire of the Mizbeach. It's not a new designation.
No, but it sounds like the discussion can also be, I agree with you, however, the definition doesn't take hold until you actually lit the...
Maybe, but they don't talk about that stage. They're not talking about that stage. They're talking about it right away. So now the Gemara gives a different version of the whole discussion. We could flip it around and say, you know what? When you just remove fire from the Mizbeach and put it on the ground, everybody agrees you're exempt. Exempt. Okay? In other words, everybody agrees with Rava in the way that we understood Rava initially. Okay? That doesn't. If you're not up there, it doesn't count anymore. Nobody disagrees. The machloket is when you're on the Mizbeach, when you're up there getting the fire. Well, none of us would be because you have to be a Kohen. But Abaye Amar Chayav Esh HaMizbeach. Abaye would say, as long as you're on the Mizbeach, even though you took in your shovel the ashes or the fire and you're standing up there, you're still on the Mizbeach. It's still Esh HaMizbeach. However, Rava says, Rava Amar Patur came with the nitka. Rava will say, once you remove it, once it's removed, it's removed. You're exempt. In other words, even though you're still standing on the Mizbeach.
So you don't have to redefine it according to that?
Wait. Let's get to that. Let's get to the end first.
Oh, okay.
No. Right. Don't jump because it's going to get confusing. Okay. We have to go back to our innocence and naivete for a moment. Okay. So the assumption right now is, forget about the redesignation because that came later in the discussion before, right? We're just assuming it's physical location, right? So Rava is saying once you lift it off its normal place, off the pyre, it doesn't matter that you're standing on the Mizbeach. It's not fire of the Mizbeach anymore. Abaye will say as long as you're standing on the Mizbeach, even though it's not on the pyre anymore, you're still on the Mizbeach. It's Esh HaMizbeach. But if you jump down, not Esh HaMizbeach anymore, according to everybody in this version. Okay? Now the Gemara asks, now it's going to be a problem. But that which Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba bar Avua. That if somebody were to take a coal off of the mizbeach and then extinguish it, chayav. And that's talking about when you're not on the mizbeach anymore. Now wait a second. Laka Abaye v'laka Rava. It's not Kiman. Who's this going to follow? Laka Abaye v'laka Rava. It's not going to follow either Abaye or Rava. Why not? Because Abaye and Rava are agreeing that if it's not, according to this version, both of them agree that if you're not on the mizbeach, it's definitely not Esha mizbeach anymore. So how can Rav Nachman say that in the name of Rabba Bar Avuha that it is Esha mizbeach? If you take a coal off, now it's not going to agree with anybody. Before it would have agreed with both of them, or at least with Abaye. Now it doesn't agree with anybody. So again, hatam la intik lemitzvata, hacha intik lemitzvata. According to this version, everybody agrees with the distinction of the previous version. In other words, when it's removed for a mitzvah, then it's going to lose its status. So basically, in the second version of the discussion, Abaye and Rava agree when you're off the mizbeach with what Rava said in the first version. Meaning, if you removed it for a mitzvah and you came off the mizbeach, everybody's going to agree it no longer has a status anymore. If it just stam came off, somebody removed fire from the mizbeach or it fell off, it still has the status, even though it's physically not up there anymore. The machloket is, what if you're standing on the mizbeach itself and you took it off in order to do the mitzvah? Do we say, yes, very nice that you took it to do the mitzvah, but you're still standing up there, so it's still Esha mizbeach? That's what Abaye says. Rava says, since you picked it up in order to bring it to do a mitzvah, it immediately loses its status, even though physically you're still located on the top of the mizbeach. However, once you come off the mizbeach, both of them will agree, since you removed it for a mitzvah, it doesn't have the Kiddusha anymore. Now, however, according to Rav Nachman's cases where it was removed not for a mitzvah. And that's why. So in both cases, they interpret Rav Nachman's case as the same. That it was removed not for a mitzvah, it retains its status. When you remove it for a mitzvah, that's where the discussion is going to be applicable. The only question is, in the first version, everyone agreed if you're on the mizbeach, even if you removed it for a mitzvah, it doesn't change status until you get off. According to the second version, that as long as you're on the mizbeach, that when you're on the mizbeach, that's where the machloket is. That Rava will say even up there, as soon as you remove it from the pyre for the sake of a mitzvah, it's going to lose its status. And that's Hadran alach taraf bekalpi, Hadran alach taraf bekalpi. That is the conclusion of the paper.